Okay, welcome back. Welcome to our final session for today. It is my great honor to introduce Hortense J. Spillers, who will be our final speaker of the day. Hortense J. Spillers is the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor of English at Vanderbilt University. Since receiving her PhD from Brandeis University, she has taught at Wellesley College, Haverford College, Emory University, and Cornell College. She has also served as a guest professor at Duke University's literature program and during tri-semester terms at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies at Freie Universität, Berlin. She teaches courses in American and African American literature, William Faulkner, and feminist theory. A recipient of numerous honors and awards, among them grants from the Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation. She has also been a fellow at the National Humanities Center, Research Triangle, and the Center for Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences. While at Haverford, she was chair of the English department for 2 years before moving to Cornell, where she joined the Norton Projects by serving as one of the period editors of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. Her collection of scholarly essays, Black, White, and in Color, Essays of American Literature and Culture, was published in 2003, and with Marjorie Priest, she co-edited Conjuring Black Women, a Fiction and Literary Tradition in 1985. For the English Institute, Spillers edits a series of collected essays, Comparative American Identities, Race, Sex, and Nationality in the Modern Text. Hortense Spillers also serves on editorial boards, including the editorial collective of the journal Boundary 2, and is a former member of the Executive Council of the Modern Language Association. Her essays appear in the New Centennial Review, Das Argument, and Boundary 2, among others. She is currently at work on 2 new projects, The Idea of Black Culture and Black Women and Early State Formations. She travels extensively, and we are so fortunate for her to join us here today, since she literally just landed hours ago. She travels extensively and lectures widely, both at home and abroad, most recently delivering the Henry Louis Gates Jr. Lecture at Yale University in 2016, and the W.E.B. Du Bois prestigious lecture at Harvard University in 2014. And the 2010 Sidney Warhaft Distinguished Memorial Lecture at the University of Manitoba. She received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the literary journal Callaloo in 2016 and was honored with the Nicholas Guillen Lifetime Achievement Award by the Caribbean Philosophical Association in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Hortense Spillers. Thank you.
I wish to thank Rizvana for that wonderful introduction. This is a great audience. Glad to see you. This is my first time in your city and in your beautiful country. I'm very glad to be here. And as Rizvana said, I just got off a plane a few minutes ago, so if I'm a little incoherent, you might understand why that's the case, but I hope I won't be too much. The question of touch, to be at hand without mediation or interference, might be considered the gateway to the most intimate experience and exchange of mutuality between subjects, or taken as the fundamental element of the absence of self-ownership. For example, it defines at once, in the latter instance, the most terrifying personal and ontological feature of slavery's regimes across the long ages, yet touch for 20th century critics, notably the late Audre Lorde, reverts to the realm of the erotic as it does in Toni Morrison's Beloved, which deploys the contradictory valences of the haptic on either side of an emancipatory project. To the Bone would attempt an entry into this formidable paradox, which unfolds a troubled intersubjective legacy, and perhaps troubled to the extent that one of these valences of touch is not walled off from the other, but haunts it, shadows it as its own twin possibility. My own interest in the question of touch has been touched off, let's say, by an ongoing inquiry into the status of enslaved women in the revolutionary era of the 18th century. Specifically, two sites in the Americas, Saint-Domingue in the Antilles, en route to Haiti as the world's first Black republic, and the pre-revolutionary colony of British North America that will become the United States of America. What unfolds in this transatlantic context, if we read it in light of the emergence of the modern French state, as C.L.R. James does in his spectacular work, The Black Jacobins, these revolutionary circumstances reconfigure our entire understanding of notions of family, or it certainly reconsidered mine, or reconfigured rather, my understanding of family, of public and private, of intimacy, sentiment, touch, affection. It seems to me that our entire vocabulary of the intimate sphere and regimes of mutuality put in place by a traditional sentimental education are challenged by the problematic of slavery. The practice of concubinage, for instance, so prevalent across the sweep of the Atlantic world, conduces to what we might call the shadow family, the one that runs concurrent with the official family. This emergent demographic was so vividly insistent in what I would call its incontrovertible quiddity, that it led Frederick Douglass, radical Black figure of a young United States, to remark that the sexual liaison between masters and enslaved African women had engendered the spatio-temporal phenomenon which Douglass called new people on the southern tier of the United States. One of the most well-known instances of Douglass's new people involved the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, and his liaison with his dead wife's half-sister, Sally Hemings. Annette Gordon Reed's researches on the Jeffersons and the Hemingses of Monticello have taken us far along the path of understanding what relations between shadow families and official families might have looked like in the late 18th century. But I tend to think that the Jefferson-Hemings case did not define the norm, just as we wish to broaden the lens across the whole terrain of intimacy under conditions of enslavement, and whether or not we would be justified in calling such relations intimacy at all. In a circumstance where flesh becomes the medium of exchange, it is hard to imagine what intimacy is, or what the career of touch would be under conditions defined by violent coercion. What an investigator is looking for in this case tends to evade the archive and to disappear into the world of the everyday. If the shadow families of the master class were defined primarily by their economic relations to the master, then how did this intrusion of money matters, or was it an intrusion, transform structures of feeling between husbands and wives and sibling relations within the official family? In other words, we do not expect master families to carry on, quote, as usual, whatever as usual is. And that just occurred to me that there was really no such thing as a normal under conditions of slavery, as I understand it. Those people who are enslaved and then those people who were not. I mean, it seems to me that the whole is affected by institutions of ownership, or in a world where human beings have become property. So we don't expect master families to carry on as usual when the conditions of slavery prevail. So it is within this social calculus that I wish to insinuate myself in trying to imagine what it must have felt like to have been manhandled. And this must be some of the prevailing logic in Toni Morrison's Beloved as characters from across the line, in this case, the Ohio River, which established in the antebellum period of the United States, slave states and free states. Those characters are learning to distinguish between touch when it is curative, healing, erotic, restorative, and touch when it is a violation of the boundaries of ego in the enslaved that were not yet accorded egoistic status, or in brief subjecthood, subjectivity. Baby Suggs's sermons in the woods, as readers of Morrison might remember, are an effort to reacquaint the former enslaved with parts of the body, something so simple and elegant as the hands, because there in slavery, she intones, they did not love your hands. What we would regard as bodily gestures that do not require a great deal of thought become for Morrison's dramatis personae passages to be negotiated across a corporeal surface. Thus bearing her back to Paul D. long years after a scar in the shape of a chokecherry tree has been carved into it after repeated whippings. A curative touch might restore feeling to damaged nerve endings, but it is going to take a while. If proximity between members of the master class and the enslaved assured neither intimacy nor protection in this social order, if sexual partners and their children could be sold off and shadow families assert no claims to the human dignity of the legitimate family, and feelings of love and sentiment are shown to be unstable, did slavery across the Americas rupture ties of kinship and filiation so completely that the 18th century demolishes what Constance Classen in the deepest sense, a cultural history of touch called a tactile cosmology. When in an earlier piece of writing I pursued a distinction between body and flesh, I was attempting to isolate features of citizen belonging from alien bodies and entities. I would associate bodiedness with juridical personality or historical actors who have access to what constitutional law calls due process. I'm going to take a drink of water. Wow. Anybody else need a drink? You may have one. Under the impress of constitutional law or due process, other rights-bearing follows in its wake. Flesh describes an alien entity, a more or less expendable figure, and this is an alien by all the ways that people can be alien, by race or language or culture and custom, and is in any case not having access to the protocols of due process. But perhaps its most poignant determination is the extent to which such a body cannot prevent or ward off another's touch. For me, the single most powerful evidence of the loss of freedom is the fact that bodies lose their integrity and may be invaded or entered or penetrated, so to speak, by coercive power. This touch that we associate with intimacy can, under the right conditions, engender invasion and violence, and in its immediacy, in relationship to the enslaved, robs the haptic of its power to heal, to bind, to cure, and becomes instead the power to wound and violate. Another note from Klassen's work on the history of touch. And the sensory scale of races created by the natural historian Lawrence Oken, the civilized European eye man who focused on the visual world was positioned at the top, and the African skin man who used touch as his primary sensory modality at the bottom. I thought that was an interesting reading on, comparative reading on the senses. So I am suggesting that under slavery's regime, the captive body's susceptibility to being touched places this body on the side of the flesh, so that touching here is not a token of social cohesion, of brotherhood, or fellowship, or fellow feeling, but rather the very breadth and depth of alienation, among other things, alienation from the laws, and perhaps even ways of distinguishing human life from bare life. And that's a little piece of the puzzle that belongs to a larger paper, and the way the larger paper ends is to suggest that without freedom, love and intimacy don't matter. Okay? Thank you. think I'm going to now talk to Rizvana. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today again, and for your remarks. I think that they're very provocative. I think maybe I'll offer some comments and summation points, and then we can have a conversation. One of the reasons why I think inviting you has been so important for all of us that are trying to approach and think about touch in more contemporary registers, right, is that we have to remember this other historical underside, right? That the sort of grammars of touch are quite different under the sort of painful rubrics of slavery, right, of historical slavery. And I think of you as someone who is, I think you're someone who is one of the foremost thinkers in terms of theorizing intimacy and bringing historical intimacies to bear on the present. I'm reminded in thinking about the ways in which your work is informed by the historical archives of the 18th and 19th century. I'm reminded of a line from Aracelis Girmay's poetry that we heard today. I think the line is, I am touched by the dead. And that line to me is quite provocative because it makes me think about what it means to read with an archive, but also against the grain of the archive. And I think that both of those things are required when, someone like you is doing the work of theorizing touch historically. One of the things that I think is quite compelling in terms of starting from the Jefferson-Hemings liaison, right, is that what you told us is that the forms of sexual congress, right, the forms of intimacy that develop within that kind of a historical context, right, that kind of intimacy is not and cannot be the same as the more contemporary forms of intimacy, right, that we think about today, right, and the sort of social grammars that inform more contemporary forms of intimacy. The other thing that I think is quite important about what you were theorizing is this idea about the sort of what you term the contrary valences of hapticality, right? And this troubled intersubjective legacy, right, that you're pointing to as, for example, the one between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, really foregrounds what you're calling the emergence of shadow worlds, right? Shadow worlds that emerge, shadow worlds and shadow families, right? That you call that you refer to as a kind of emergent demographic. And what I think is so compelling about that theorization is that these shadow worlds really come to animate the machinery of the nation state as we know it, right? These shadow worlds, these shadow filial compositions, right, or bonds, really come to animate the space of, right, the nation as such, but also the forms of contemporary citizenship, right, that we've come to recognize. And, some more points of summation very quickly. You end with a kind of distinction between touch as curative and touch as violative, right? And you say quite provocatively that the body loses its integrity precisely because under historical slavery, it can be invaded by a coercive power. And the haptic becomes robbed of its power to heal or cure. And quite provocatively, right, without freedom, there can be no such thing as, right, what we have been gesturing toward as haptic intimacy, right, or haptic forms of touch that are curative and reparative, if you will. I think that, of course, I would have, I really want to now hear the longer talk, right, where you talk about human life and bare life. But what's so provocative about that, for me at least, is that, of course, this thing that is referred to as bare life becomes the sort of register for, and the measure for, right, our kind of contemporary biopolitical moment, right? But what I think is so interesting about that is that you bring us back to touch, right, and tactility and relations of intimacy as the very sort of conditions of possibility for thinking about the distinction between human life and bare life. So it's not, right, it's not just simply domination and power, right? That this element of intimacy and touch also has to be thought of, right, in relation to domination and power. So I want to kind of, have a conversation. What I'm really interested in is this idea of shadow worlds. There's something really compelling to me about that. And then I have a whole other set of questions about Black culture, okay. But I'll wait on those for a bit.
It occurred to me not too long ago that we think about the relations of concubinage as something unusual. And one of the reasons why we think that is precisely because of the Jefferson Hemings liaison. But it occurred to me in working on the Du Bois lectures that concubinage must have been just as common as blades of grass all over the complex of the New World, and that wherever slavery touched down, it became a part of the social order. And that's made me begin to think that what we understand as intimacy today may be troubled in some of the same ways. Even though we're in certainly a different historical era, but I wonder to what extent people who are supposed to be in intimate relations are really in violent relations, right? Date rape on our campuses, for example, or all the stories against the Hollywood mogul and people in positions of power who touch people inappropriately. I mean, that charge even against the President of the United States, right? So, I wonder if we're really talking about a situation, and I have perhaps no right to claim this, but I'm wondering if to be a woman in the world has always meant to be susceptible to being touched in those ways, so that slavery becomes the baseline human condition, that it did not just happen to African people or people with dark skin, but that it has happened all over the place, everywhere, and that nobody has been protected from it. And I've even thought that women in the official families under conditions of enslavement were in their own way as violated and in as much trouble as the women who were enslaved. And I don't want to take the sting out of slavery itself, but what I'm suggesting is that I'm not sure that it was a happy circumstance to be the wife of a member of the master class, right? I mean, if you're watching a man daily beat women and children and other men and violate their humanity, well, you know, I'm not sure you ought to say you in love with that person. I'm kind of thinking maybe you need to check your whole card, as we say in the U.S., or your back trail or something. Because maybe something is going on that you might want to think about. The tragedy, it seems to me, is that the women in those circumstances did not always understand that their alignment should be with this woman over here, not with that guy who's violating people left and right, and then coming home and telling you how lovely you are. I mean, do people, people believe that? Really? Huh, well, this topic has thrown this whole question for me in crisis, right? The free world and the enslaved world. And it seems to me that they were all one world. And if that's true, then what does that do with our repertoire of the sentiments and ways we talk about sentiment, love, sexuality, right? I mean, it seems to me that all of that is in crisis, so that at no point, I'm thinking, was slavery hidden over here somewhere. That it did create a world of interstices and shadows, things unaccounted for, things you couldn't talk about, secrets. There's a famous pair of psychoanalysts who talk about crypts and graves. Some of you will, I can't think right now who they are, but all the things that a society has to bury when you have so much going on elsewhere that you cannot acknowledge or articulate or look at. I mean, I've often wondered about the contradictions in the life of Thomas Jefferson, and I just get more and more puzzled the more I look at it, right? Because here's a subject that's been treated in history and fiction. There is a fiction that people in the audience might know, a novel called Sally Hemings by a black writer who's lived in France now for a number of years, Barbara Chase Ribot. And the Sally Hemings character in the fiction confronts the Thomas Jefferson character in the fiction one evening by the fireplace at Monticello. I think the novel might be too much of a romance for me, but in any case, what happens in this particular scene is that the Jefferson character is lamenting the loss of Meriwether Lewis, of the famous Lewis and Clark expeditionary team. And he's saying, you know, I don't have any sons to teach surveying and landscaping and so on, and I'm unhappy about that. And Sally Hemings says to the Jefferson character, but you have 5 sons. And his response to her is, you have 5 sons. Not me. You do. And so that fictional instance made me wonder even more about what must it have been like to live in the personality of so famous and important a figure who in some ways could possibly not acknowledge the intimate relations with that family. And I think that whatever those contradictions are that we observe in a figure like Jefferson, I believe that we observe similar in my countrymen today. I believe that my country is very much in a kind of denial about and contradiction about a number of elements, so that in that regard, Jefferson was truly a founder of his country, right? And he is a paradigmatic white-collar personality, I think. I think I see Jefferson in a lot of different places in the U.S. That, I know that probably got way off your question, but...
No, I mean, it wasn't really a question, it was just kind of an opening.
Comment,
but
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is that the relations engendered by, historical racial slavery have messed up our intimacies, right? Messed up our, and haunt and mess up our, have messed up our grammars of intimacy.
Yeah.
And that this actively is something that actively haunts the present, is haunting the present.
Yeah.
And, I don't think that it is a drastic, comparison to make between the figures you name and discuss, right? You just named and discussed the plantation mistresses, for example, the figure of the plantation mistress who aligns with the master's brutality, right, against the enslaved woman, right? To make a leap to the contemporary moment where you have profound support by, women for the current sort of brutal regime of governmentality in the U.S.
That's exactly where I was going.
Okay.
That's exactly what I meant.
I'm trying to still be genteel here, but
Yeah,
I think
that's exactly what I mean. I mean, women, 42% of white women in the United States elected this man president of the United States. Are you kidding me? What, is that a joke? What is that, a joke? It's not a joke. That happened. And you say, how the hell did that happen? How could that happen?
after all of these sort of
Yeah.
revelations about sexual violation came out.
Absolutely. And so you look around and you go, well, my goodness, maybe this has a historical precedent. Mm-hmm. It's displaced onto another century, other circumstances. We therefore don't recognize that we've seen this before, in a sense. What's your sense of solidarity? What the hell is that? I mean, if you don't do it because it's another human being, at least because it's another woman, right? Mm-hmm. And I've run into so many women who said to me, I just didn't like Hillary Clinton. Just didn't like her. And you say, but you like this guy? What? Sometimes I don't believe I'm talking to other human beings. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're also describing, is this accrual of political power in the figure of like whatever masculinity, however impoverished that that is. But also, and I think this goes back to something Lynette was saying, very early on in the day. But the figure of the feminine is always already prone, right? As always already open, and violable, is also something that I see your work measuring and trying to take account of. Because going back to the figures in the historical figures in question, the plantation mistress is not going to side with the one who is prone, if right there's a struggle for political power in the domestic sphere, right? The plantation mistress is going to side with the master. And I know you've spoken about, and this is a very difficult film to talk about and watch, and I actually don't like the film, but that's not the point. Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave.
Yeah.
Actually, in that film, the plantation mistress, I've written about this a bit, but the plantation mistress, Mrs. Epps, becomes more sadistic than the master, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sort of doubles down on the domestic sphere, right?
Yeah.
Precisely because her claim to a certain kind of heterosexual intimacy or Congress is under threat, right? Anyway.
Yeah, well, that's...
These things haunt the present, is the point.
Yeah, yeah, they do.
Yeah.
That film started me thinking, because if, in my mind, and this might not be correct, but in my mind, the film is edited this way. There's a scene where, is it Lupita?
Lupita Nyong'o.
Nyong'o and
Fassbender. Michael Fassbender.
Fassbender have a copulation scene. The next scene, she's being whipped. Now it might not have actually happened that way in the sequence of the film, but in my mind it happened, in my imagination it happened that way. And so that becomes a kind of puzzle that you can beat until she bleeds, the woman that you just slept with the night before. And even if you say, well, they didn't think that those people were human, it's something that reverts to the person who's doing that we have to question the humanity of, right? So that for me, the question about the humanity of the enslaved is really displaced by another question. I start asking about the human someplace else, right? But that's a very odd moment in a difficult film to watch. It actually took me 2 years to watch it. I mean, in other words, I just refused to go because I knew what was in it. I knew that it was not, maybe Steve McQueen's wife had just found it, but I knew about the narrative long before and knew what was in it. And what's in these narratives, for the most part, they're very difficult to read because they are full of torture, what we would call torture today, and what Amnesty International would call our attention to today as torture. I knew that was there, so that I was not anxious to see that on film. But seeing it on film, it started me down the road to questioning. Well, how do you explain those relationships that are marked by what should be the most intimate moments between people and the most violent moments between people? Some people might want to say that both scenes were erotic, but that's interesting. I don't want to go there, but some people might say that in violence, that a certain kind of violence is has an erotic register. But I don't know about that in the case I'm talking about.
Right, I mean,
or maybe period.
Yeah, I think I think you qualifying that without freedom there can be no, right, sort of, what is the line that you ended on? It was so lovely.
Yeah, without freedom there can be no love.
Without freedom there can be no love, which is a radical proposition and assertion. And it's something that I want to think more about myself because, I think that thinking about the fullness of that really requires that you sit with the figures in the archive, right? And sit with the sort of historical circumstances and situations they endured, and the sort of quotidian violences they suffered, right? And to kind of inhabit that historical space in a way that we aren't always, in our sort of contemporary situatedness, always able to inhabit, right, and endure. And I know that another person who has thought about this and written about it is Saidiya Hartman, a bit, right? The way that, and I also think another element of this, another portion of this, is the way the archive resists us, right? Resists being read, right? But I think that we may have time for one or two questions before we wrap up. I do want to thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your conversation and what you shared earlier. I'm really glad that we're at the point of the archive and thinking about how to be intimate or to inhabit these very difficult spaces and narratives, especially in a city like Amsterdam. You can imagine that it's full of difficult corridors of documents and stories that I think are only just being made visible and shared and actually discussed, which is exciting as well as challenging, I think. And I just wondered what your thoughts might be on how also as artists and educators in the room we could inhabit or be intimate with those kinds of difficult documents and difficult archives without kind of repeating the sort of violent intimacy that you've also spoken towards. And it's a very big question, but I just wondered what your thoughts were for us, maybe where we're sitting. Thank you.
Maybe we can collect some questions.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I think there was another one behind you.
Well, just thank you so much, Rizvana, for the day, and thank you, Hortense Spillers, for all of the work that you've done over so many years. We're very grateful to you. I wanted to hear you say a little bit more about this final sentence, this conclusory sentence that was really so incredible, I thought. If you could just maybe provide a definition of what you think freedom is.
That's
a large final question.
Yeah.
We'll collect the questions.
That is a large final question. And the question about the archive, too. But let me start with the one about freedom. I guess most immediately, I would say that freedom is emancipation, but then in a deeper sense. And I really meant it in the deeper sense. And I think I was, when I had that thought, I was looking at novels that tend to, Barbara Chase's novel that turns the liaison between Hemings and Jefferson into a love affair. And what I was suggesting in the case of Sally Hemings, who was never emancipated by Jefferson, I'm not sure that you could call that love at all. And that's why I said what I said about unless you're free, I mean, unless you can call your body your own and your life your own, your soul your own, then none of these other things, as important as they are, will matter, nor can you claim them, right? And that's what I was thinking. As for that archive, I think you're probably the only people who can get in those archives, right? Or what are people from Amsterdam called? Amsterdammers? Okay. I think you're probably the only the only people who can get in the archives. I think I would probably worry about my attitude toward them later on, but to get in them, because we need to know what's in them. So I wouldn't be afraid to get in them, right? Whosoever will, let them come. Yeah.
I feel like just as a quick response to your question, Julia, I also want to know what freedom is. However, I feel like your question, maybe I'm being unfair and we can have a discussion after, but I feel like your question is more like, what do we need to do to get free given that this legacy that Hortense Spillers is describing has infected the social calculus, right? What she calls the social calculus. Like there's this ongoing infection of the social calculus, so then how do we get free, right? And that I think that, linking the two questions, I think this has to be a practice of getting free, with respect to reading the archive, right? This kind of ongoing practice of discovering and exposing archives, right? And doing this kind of archival work is how we begin to get free.
Yeah, I think that's right. It won't be done in one fell swoop.
Well, thank you so much. I know
Thank you.
you're so tired, but thank you so much for being here with us today. It was really such a
Well, great job. Thank you.